Jim, here's our next question. Sent to CornyDriveThru.
Yes, Brian, here's my next answer.
Sent to CornyDriveThru at gmail.com. This is from Sam in South Africa. Good day, Jim and What?
Some of what?
No, Sam. S-O-M.
Oh, just not some, but Sam.
Sam.
All right. Well, what does Sam say?
Well, it's not a somber email. Let's get to the question here. Good day, Jim and Brian. Hope you're both doing all right. I recently remembered that The Rock's daughter, Simone Johnson, had been training at the WWE Performance Center for a while. However, she has yet to debut or even be mentioned on any WWE programming. I think she signed around the same time as Rex Steiner, aka Braun Breaker, for those of you kids out there. From your experience, Jim, is there any difference in the way you train someone who has a parent who was a famous, accomplished name in the wrestling business? And do you think they are taking longer with her because of that reason? Would Jim have trained someone like Randy Orton any differently had he not been a third-generation wrestler? And the subject line here, Jim, was training a second-generation wrestler. So how is that different from training someone with no family wrestling background whatsoever?
Well, I don't think you train anybody any different because they come from a wrestling family. I think the advantage that somebody has that comes from a wrestling family is that they've grown up around it. They've heard it talked about it. Well, if they've been in that parent's life, they've heard about it. They've talked about it at home. They've seen more of it. They have a more fully rounded understanding of what it's supposed to be and what it is, rather than somebody's just walked in off the street, or these days now that's read about it only on the internet and as a result has gotten a significant portion of everything about the wrestling business wrong because they've read about it on the internet. And it's worse when you think you know the correct story and you don't really, and you don't know that you don't know the shit that's right. So having a parent or some family member precede you in the business can help weed some of that out, but you don't train anybody differently. It's just that gives them maybe a little bit more mental aptitude to pick up what you're talking about. As far as, like with Orton, he was a third generation wrestler. He probably had never seen his well, let me try to do the math here. He'd never seen his grandfather wrestle except for if there was film or, a few things that he might have seen. But I'm sure he saw a good bit of his dad. And especially when he was, under 10 years old. So that registers in your mind, and you probably want to do a few things like your father or whatever. But at the same time, everybody's going to be different. And Randy is so much more, I guess, of a well-rounded athlete than Bob Orton Jr. was. Bob was an amazing worker, and he was in good wrestling shape, but he didn't have a great physique. Randy does. He didn't come off the top rope very much, if at all, with anything, but Randy does.
Superplex.
Well, I'm talking about jumping off flying cross bodies and these missile drop kicks and all that shit. Superplex coming off, you're not coming off the top. You got your feet firmly on the second rope and you're dropping that other motherfucker off the top. But I'm just saying that the second generation guys and third generation guys are usually end up being a better athlete than their father was because of training methods and just progress. But it's not often that a guy ends up being the worker that his father was. And Randy has made a great fucking career for himself. I still don't know, even as good as he is, that if he was recognized in his field at his time as good in the ring as Bob Orton Jr. was during his time. Jeff Jarrett, be honest, Jeff, not only a better athlete, but a better worker than Jerry was. Jerry's work was all mental. His physical work was nothing to write home about. It didn't need to be 50 years ago. So, what were the other questions asked within the body of that
Well, you kind of covered a lot of it, but let me ask you this in terms of training wrestlers who, or training guys to be wrestlers who have a family background in wrestling. Have you had instances where it goes the other way, where the fact that they grew up around the business was a detriment and it was hard to train them or get through to them or get them to do things differently?
Well, no, not that. There have been, and we've all seen the second generations that just didn't work out. I don't remember anybody that particularly was looked at or viewed wrestling in a screwy way that you had to break them of that kind of bad habit. They just didn't have the talent in the ring to carry it off. And I mean, that's always been the case. You know, earlier in the show, we talked about Tom Renesto's kids. They sucked. Lynn Rossi was one of the biggest baby faces in the history of Nick Goulas's promotion. His son, Joey, all he had to be was passable, and he would have been a main event guy. He wasn't passable. Poor Bruno, David Sammartino, Bruno Jr. You know, so there's always that, but it's not necessarily that they've learned anything bad that you have to break them from their family. They just they weren't blessed with the personality or the ability.
You also said something interesting before about sometimes, I forget the way you said it, but a second generation wrestler who has a relationship with their family, I think was close to what you said.
No, I'm saying if the younger person was in the parent's life at the time. For Brian Pillman Jr. is a second generation wrestler, but through unfortunate circumstances, most of his life he grew up without his dad, obviously. So there was nobody in the family to be talking about the inside of wrestling to him in that respect. And then there's been other situations where a son of a wrestler would get involved in the business, even though there was a breakup early on, and the mother might have raised that kid, and so he wasn't around constantly. It wasn't like his dad was taking him to the matches. So it just depends on, what was the father still active in the business, or was he received? When Dusty had Dustin, he was still on top. But when Dusty had Cody, he had transitioned already to, more of a backstage role. So you're still growing up with the guy, but you're getting two different attitudes, two different viewpoints from a guy who's on top in wrestling and then a guy who's transitioned, and you don't get to go out and see him work every night. You get to see the stuff that he has produced. It's knowledge, but it's still different.
Was it like a given that Lawler, Dundee, and Jarrett will all have their kids get into wrestling? Or, I mean, was there a point where you thought, wow, these guys are going to all have their kids in wrestling? Or was it a surprise in any of these cases to you?
Well, when I was there, it would have been a surprise in everybody's case, because Dundee's kid, Lawler's kid, and Jarrett's kid, when I was photographer and or working the territory, was between 5 and 12 years old. So it would have been a surprise for all of them. But obviously the way it transpired, it's no surprise because those guys had homesteaded that territory. And because of obviously Jarrett was owner, then Lawler became part owner. Dundee was figured in as long as he wanted to be there because of his relationship with Jarrett and the fact that he was, on the all-time Mount Rushmore of box office attractions in the territory. With Jerry Jarrett, when Jeff came along, it was natural. That Jerry Jarrett would want his son to follow in his footsteps, and with the eventual thought, I'm sure, of owning and running the territory. And Jeff, had already been a high school athlete, and of course he turns pro when he's 18, so there's not even any college. They didn't wait for college in wrestling back in those days. With Lawler, I think Brian was a little bit shorter, but at the same time, even though he didn't have the size, he had more of the personality, because Jeff, when he was, younger, it took a while for the personality bulb to come on. So Brian was, a personality from the start, and he took to the promo aspect and the showbiz aspect. I think the biggest surprise was Dundee with Jamie, because Jamie was both so small, so skinny, and ended up he could work his ass off. He might have been the best worker, straight and focused, of all of them, just in the ring with all the stuff he could do. But between the size and then the fact that he became a lunatic and, alienated a lot of people, he had probably the third most successful career out of those three people. But with them being there, their fathers being in the business, in the office, ownership, or highly, of high repute with the fans in that area, it's no surprise that they wanted to follow in their dad's footsteps, nor were they given the chance, because if Jarrett knew if any of the three of them clicked, that would be better for the business there. And he didn't care whether, I don't think Lawler's son or Dundee's son ever went anywhere else. I'm sure he had aspirations for Jeff, but it's not a surprise. It ends up being kind of ironic that Jeff ended up being the most successful one overall, because he's the only one that ended up really following in his father's footsteps and getting into management and promotion.